Are you familiar with the 23rd Psalm? It goes like this: though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. But is that true? Don't you fear evil? Don't you fear death? It seems like we are in that valley right now. I mean, you flip on the news and all it is about the virus. Or you look around the world and you see the tentacles of death just creeping further and further and further into our lives. We've all experienced it. We've tasted death firsthand. We have seen it in the physical realm. We have all worn those nice clothes, and we've sat feet away from a casket and we hear someone go up and share about the deceased, and often they say something like, why? It's not right. We've all tasted that. We've all experienced the impact of death in our lives. Perhaps you've been the one in the waiting room, waiting in that sterilized place where time seems to stand still, even though people are walking by us constantly, waiting to see what the doctor has to say about that loved one who is in that room down the hall. Or maybe you're waiting to see what the doctor's prognosis is about your own life, your own health, your own care. We see it in relationships. There's division, and they break and they die, and there's nothing we can do to revive them, and it breaks our hearts because we don't want that. We see it in everyday life, not just in physical death of our human bodies, but the flower bouquet that sits in the center of the table, that's beautiful, but within days starts to brown around the edges, and then the petals drop and everything weeps and falls dead. Death is everywhere. You can't get away from it. It's involved in every aspect of our lives, and perhaps you wonder why. Why is death everywhere? Not just in here with our own lives and our own bodies aging and decaying, but out there everywhere in relationships and the way people interact. They seem to be cutting each other down instead of seeking to have life thrive. Paul gives us a glimpse in Romans chapter 5. Verse 12, he says this: sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin. And so death spread to all men because all sin. Paul is going back to the very beginning of the story, the very beginning of our history, in that perfect garden that God has created. After He has created all things, He creates man and woman. And they live where there's no sin. And because there's no sin, they live where there's no death. Can you imagine a world without death? I mean, we try to wrap our minds again around that idea, but we struggle because we've never experienced that. But Paul is saying that because of the sin of that one man, sin has crept into the lives of all mankind. And so wherever man is, sin is. And sin hasn't just scarred or marred humanity. Sin has brought death to all of creation. Where's the connection? Well, in the very next chapter, Paul writes, "For the wages of sin is death." We deserve death. Why? Because that's the payment for our work. That's the payment for our behavior and our actions and what we've done. It's the payment we all deserve. We can think we don't deserve it, but the reality is we all do. Because we've all sinned. We've sinned against one another, But more importantly, we've sinned against God. God is good. And it is right for him to punish sin with death. And so, it's Good Friday. And we are wondering, perhaps, and I'm intentionally doing this, I'm loading us heavy on this idea of death, because unless we realize that what we deserve is death, unless we realize that our sin is producing death in our own lives, in the lives of our loved ones, in the lives of our co-workers, in the lives of random people we rub shoulders with, our sin is producing, earning death. And I want us to ponder that, because we have to feel that weight. You have earned death. And in your human hands, they are weak, and there's nothing they can do to somehow merit, like through good works or by checklists. Today I'm going to do this, this, and this, because you've tried it and you failed again and again and again. We all have. Do you feel the weight? Have you tasted the sting of death in your life? You've stood over the hole in the ground as a loved one was lowered in. You've seen things that should have been good, that should have lasted, decay and die. Ponder about that for a moment. We deserve death. It's our payment. But God, in love, in mercy, has chosen to do something. I'm going to pause here, and I want you to kind of jump here to something else to think about. God came in flesh. God comes in the form of a man. He is born to a teenage girl, a virgin in a manger in a little nothing town of Bethlehem, for the purpose of being a sacrifice. Because there's nothing we could do. God had to do something. So God comes and he lives the perfect life that neither you or I could. He tasted the sting of death. He experienced it. I love the picture that you have of him in John's Gospel, where he hears the news that his friend Lazarus has died. And he weeps. He weeps. It breaks his heart. Death isn't what he wants. And he's dealing with it. You see, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he's having a meal with his disciples, and most people believe he's having a Passover meal. And a Passover meal is a really interesting meal because it's a celebratory meal, but they're celebrating, the Jewish people are celebrating because they are remembering what God has done. In fact, if you were to go to a Passover Seder, often it would be the youngest child or the youngest person in the room would ask this question: why is this day any different than all the others? To which you would receive, because God has done something amazing. He has redeemed us. He has taken us out of the bondage of slavery that we were under the oppression of Pharaoh, and he has redeemed us. He has brought us out from death to new life, giving us a glorious promise and a great inheritance. That's the meal that Jesus is having with his disciples on the night that he's arrested. That's the meal that celebrates the the slaughtering of the Passover lamb, the blood of the Passover lamb that would be painted on the doorpost so that the angel of death would not bring death unto the houses that had that blood painted on. And so, Jesus is a better, far greater, far superior lamb. He is God's Passover lamb. By his death, by his shed blood, those who are found under it, death passes by. Right now we live in the valley of death. But the Christian doesn't have to fear because the Christian knows it's not the end. This isn't the end. Though we might die physically, we know that we have been given life because of Christ's work and his death on the cross. He is paying the penalty for your and my sin. Jesus is drinking the full cup of God's wrath that should have been poured out on us. Jesus died. God died for you and me. God died so that you and I won't have to die. Take some time this day and ponder that question. Why is this day any different? Because God continues to redeem. You, Christian, this day is different because God has redeemed you. Not from slavery in Egypt, but from the slavery of sin. God has redeemed you from death, and he has brought you into something far greater than a location on a map. If you're not a Christian, know that you're still in this place of death. Know that sin is still ruling over your life, and so the payment for that is death. But God can change that today. Because he's already done the work that needs to be done. He who knew no sin, speaking of Christ, became sin. Why? So that we who are sinners, we who have the payment of death, can be freed from that bondage. So again, I encourage you, church, take the time to contemplate where you see death in your life. Where do you see the tentacles of the effects of sin in your life? Maybe it is in your own home. Maybe it's with your own health of your physical body. Maybe you've seen it in situations that you thought were going to go on forever and ever because they were good, but they decayed and they died. Let that weight rest on you today, tomorrow. Because when you feel that, when you see death wherever you might look, then what happens on Sunday becomes so much brighter, so much more glorious when we realize that apart from this death, we will die in the valley of death.